Good evening and welcome to the Global Business and Policy Forum. I'm Joel Fewer. I am the Executive Director of the Lowell Milken Institute, which is one of the co-sponsors of the forum, along with the UCLA Anderson School of Management Center for Global Management. And this is actually our fourth academic year of doing the forum, and we're very pleased to be here again. I'm going to tell you the rules for the evening before we introduce our presenters. This evening we're going to be talking about how to do business in emerging markets with integrity, the role of the CEO and top corporate officers. And we are lucky this evening to have two very, very special presenters, Ben Heinemann Jr. and Professor Gonzalo Freixas. After their presentations, there will be a Q&A session in which you can ask questions, and you'll be invited to give your questions. And then we'll start eating dinner, and while we're eating dinner, we'll have some questions up on these screens for you to talk about, and they will be questions that are related in general to the presentations, right, for you to sort of think about and talk about. And during dessert, I'll walk around with a microphone, and I'll ask an individual sitting at each table to spend a minute or two summarizing the conversation at the table. You don't have to tell us everything that was said, just a minute or two.
We're in a cold call.
So I asked UCLA law professor Sung-Yi Kim to introduce our speakers and to moderate the Q&A because she was the person who was responsible for contacting and bringing Ben Heinemann to our campus. Professor Kim is a graduate of Emory University and Harvard Law School. Her research interests lie in the intersections of professional responsibility, securities regulation, and corporate governance. Her scholarship has appeared in leading law journals such as the Cornell Law Review, the Georgetown Journal of Legal Ethics, and the Securities Law Review, to name just a few. So please welcome Professor Kim.
Thank you, Joel, for that lovely introduction. Can you hear me? Okay, great, perfect. So I want to publicly thank Joel for his tireless devotion to this Global Business Forum series, which has been a wonderful program for Anderson Business School students and the law students. This is my second time here, and I'm really excited about tonight's program. We will be exploring the topic of ethics in the global firm, or as a skeptic might put it, can one be a successful global firm and still maintain high ethical standards? I think that answer is yes, and tonight's distinguished speakers will tell us how this might be possible and more. So let me start off by briefly describing the illustrious backgrounds of our two speakers. Our first speaker is Ben Heinemann Jr., who will speak on the topic of how to maintain integrity while doing business in emerging markets. Mr. Heinemann graduated from Harvard College and went on to obtain his graduate degrees from Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar, and Yale Law School, where he served as editor-in-chief of the Yale Law Journal. Upon graduating from Yale Law School, he went on to clerk for Justice Stewart of the U.S. Supreme Court. And then he entered public service at the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, ending his tenure there as Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation. He entered private practice, specializing in regulatory, civil, and constitutional litigation, and eventually served as managing partner of the Washington office of Sidley and Austin. In 1987, Mr. Heinemann was appointed Senior Vice President, General Counsel, and Secretary of the General Electric Company under the legendary Jack Welch and Welch's successor, Jeffrey Immelt. And it's important to note that in that role, he oversaw the transformation of the position of general counsel from one of being, an important but really just a legal advisor to something way more important, a key member of the executive management team. In 2004, he shifted into the role of General Electric's Senior Vice President for Law and Public Affairs before officially retiring from GE a year later. Since his retirement from GE, Mr. Heinemann has been engaged in numerous activities. Just to name a few of his many roles, Mr. Heinemann has served as a senior advisor and trustee for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, general counsel for the law firm of Wilmer Hale, a senior fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and a distinguished senior fellow at Harvard Law School's program on the legal profession, as well as a lecturer at Yale Law School. In his spare time, he has received numerous awards and published numerous articles, op-eds, and books, including his most recent book, which you should all have a copy of, The Inside Counsel Revolution. Our second speaker today is Gonzalo Freixas, who will speak on the topic of ethics and global business leadership. Professor Freixas is the Associate Dean for the Fully Employed MBA program and adjunct professor at the UCLA Anderson School of Management. Professor Freixas has previously served as a faculty director for the Applied Management Research Program for the full-time MBA program and as Associate Dean of the Executive MBA program. A native of Cuba, Professor Freixas immigrated to the United States in the 1960s to flee the Castro regime. He has been a longstanding member of the California Bar and holds a law degree from Loyola Law School and a master's in business taxation from our rival University of Southern California.
We won't mention them.
Right. I should have mentioned it, right? Professor Freixas teaches business law, international business law, business ethics, corporate and individual taxation, real estate law and taxation in the MBA program and in the undergraduate accounting minor program. That's a lot of different courses. He is fluent in 4 languages and therefore has lectured in many foreign countries on international business and tax subjects. He has been a faculty director of international seminars for many executive MBA programs from other top business schools, including IE Business School in Madrid, ESSEC Business School in Paris, and Mannheim Business School in Mannheim. And I'm sure I've butchered the names of all those schools, so apologies. Professor Freixas has received numerous teaching awards from the Anderson School and has been recognized for being an outstanding faculty advisor and coach for the UCLA mock trial program, having led UCLA to win multiple national championships. Professor Freixas has served on the Board of Trustees of the Executive MBA Council, the Newhall School Board of Trustees, and the State Bar of California's Judicial Nominees Commission. So that's a lot. And I'm now tired from talking about these illustrious backgrounds. It's time for our first presentation, which will be given by Mr. Ben Heineman. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Ben Heineman.
Good luck. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. I don't know who that person is, but you're stuck with me, so it's a great pleasure to be here tonight. I love speaking to law and business students. I'm a huge believer in joint degrees. I don't know if any of you are joint degree students, but I think it's the way of the future, and so it's a great delight to be here. I want to talk about high performance and high integrity across the globe. The basic themes are: what does it mean to be a great corporation, and what does it mean to be a great lawyer or a great finance or business person inside of a corporation. Here are the issues I'm going to cover. We're going to go at sort of Mach 2, so we're going to go through a bunch of slides at sort of at warp speed. But I just want to give you a feel about the complexity of the subject and how rich it is in terms of what we do. Let me talk first. So these are the issues we're going to be covering in a very fast pace. Let me talk first about the mission of the global corporation. In my view, it's very fundamental. We fuse high performance with high integrity and sound risk management. High performance, you can see the chart, is basically strong, sustained economic growth. I would focus on the importance of superior high quality goods and services like Peter Drucker. And if you look at the last bullet, I do not believe it's about maximizing shareholder value. That is a result. It's not necessarily the goal. The goal is basically to optimize the interests of the stakeholders in the short, medium, and long term. That involves trade-offs. It's not formulaic. It's quite complicated, and it's what you do around the globe. One word, when I worked at GE, we had $220 billion in revenues, $24 billion in profits. We had 320,000 employees in 140 countries. So tonight we're going to be talking to some extent about not that institution, which was very large, but the kinds of problems that face many, many global companies now, which are operating in 100+ countries around the world, excuse me. So what is high integrity? High integrity is basically law, ethics, and values. It's basically adherence to the formal rules that are mandated outside of the company, either financial or legal. It's the voluntary adoption of global ethical standards that bind the company and its employees. And it's the employee commitment to values: honesty, candor, fairness, reliability, and trustworthiness. Those values are critical to relations inside the company, so there's not backbiting or turf fighting, and it's critical to the relationship outside the company. And so these values and these commitments to law and to ethics, combined with performance and risk management, create the trust upon which institutions are built. And this is really, if I just stop there, just that framework in terms of what a global company has to do, high performance with high integrity and risk management, is really the whole story. I mean, it's enormously complicated, but it is the framework. So when we talk about governance, we talk about shareholders versus the company, the board overseeing management, but in my view, the real issue, and what a lot of your cases are about, I think, is what management does to govern the company from the CEO down. And so I want to talk for a second. The second topic is about the CEO. And it's critical that in terms of performance with integrity, that the CEO provide committed and consistent leadership. And it's the business leaders, not the staff, who are really responsible for making performance with integrity and risk and sound risk management operational. We, the staffs, whether it's finance, HR, legal, compliance, risk, are critically important in all sorts of ways. But it's got to be the business leaders that do it, and most of all, it's got to be the CEO. The CEO is absolutely essential. And it's not tone at the top, per se. It is really building it into the institution, holding the business leaders accountable, providing the kinds of resources that are necessary. They have to put integrity first. And let me just take 1 second. The CEOs I worked for, who were, in Welch's case, an iconic CEO, and in Immelt's case, a very well-known and good CEO, would always give the same message to the business people in the company. Basically, the corporation is built on its reputation, and performance with integrity is the foundation. Each senior leader will be held accountable. There will be no cutting of corners for commercial reasons. Integrity must never be compromised to make the numbers. Integrity must never be compromised to make the numbers. That is a very powerful statement. And then at these meetings of senior officers or the general managers of the company, they would point their fingers at you, and they would say, one strike and you're out. You can miss the numbers and survive, but you cannot miss on integrity. So without going into much more detail, this kind of message from the CEO is absolutely critical, and then they have to discipline people if they don't make if they don't meet this challenge. And they can discipline them either for acts of commission, if they basically get people who bribe to work for them, or for acts of omission if they fail to create a culture of compliance. Much more to say about that, but it's the place we have to start after we talk about the mission, because so much flows from the CEO and the kind of tone they set, but more importantly, how they actually implement and execute on that. Another idea is the role of the staff. I want to talk for a second about the lawyers, but everything I'm about to say would apply to the chief financial officer and actually to the business leaders in the company. And the first question that we always have to ask is it legal? But really, at the end of the day, in terms of integrity in international business, you have to ask, is it right? And so for people like the general counsel or the CFO, it's asking about purpose, not just process, consequences, not just acts, long-term, not just short-term, strategic, not just tactical. And we have to go beyond our disciplines. We have to go beyond what we learn in business school or what we're taught in law school. We have to be citizens, because these problems are multifaceted and go way beyond the particular disciplines. There are 4 ethical responsibilities to our institution, to our clients and stakeholders, to the rule of law and the administration of justice, or in the case of the CFO, to honest and fair accounts and numbers, and then to securing public goods upon which society and the company depend and which cannot be attained through the market alone. And this applies all across the globe in all the countries in which you work. Obviously, you have to be selective, but this is a very challenging list of ethical obligations that you have. We have to, as I said, we are citizens, and so we have to have complementary competencies beyond what we learn in the professional schools and the professional setting. And let me just focus on the first and the last. We have to learn how to ask ought questions. What ought to be the appropriate arrangements, either through private ordering or through public policy? Very, very critical to this high performance with high integrity and sound risk management mission. And then on the last point, we really have to learn how to define the problems properly because they're extremely complex. And if we don't define them properly, whether it's a business problem, a product problem, a geography problem, a regulatory problem, whatever the case may be, if we don't define the problem properly, we're never going to be able to solve it. So critically important. There's a second thing that the senior people in the company have to be, and this again applies not just to the general counsel, but to the CFO, and in fact, to the business leaders. We have to be both partners and guardians. We have to be partners to the CEOs, but ultimately, one of the critical parts of being an ethical company is that we all have to be guardians of the company, and not, because we don't work for the CEO, we work for the company. We are responsible to the company, not to the CEO. And when you tell the CEO that the first time, their eyes blink. But this is the reality. And there's a dilemma, especially for the lawyers. We have to avoid being an inveterate naysayer, in which case we are excluded from meetings, or being an inveterate yay-sayer, in which case we're indicted. And sort of somewhere in between is where we have to position ourselves. There are those who say that none of us who work in corporations can do that because of the tidal pull, the lunar pull of compensation and being rewarded. But I think it can be done. Again, I've written a whole book about it. You can take a look. I won't go into any more detail. Let me focus on whether or not the board and the CEO will adopt this sort of statesperson ideal and lawyer and partner guardian ideal for the top people in the company. I think they will increasingly, not because of theory, but because of necessity. And the necessity can be stated simply, it's the enormous commercial complexity of global business today, which requires enormous talent and independent talent to help find the way to navigate through these shoals, but also because of the terribly increased importance of what I call business and society issues, whether it's legislation, regulation, enforcement, investigation, NGO pressures, ethical pressures, the publicity, investigative journalism, what have you. And this is true not just in the United States today, but it's true all around the globe. Another critical idea is, and maybe the core idea of all this, in addition to the mission and the role of the professionals and the leaders of the company as both statespeople and of partner guardians, is the integrity culture. In simplest terms, it's basically the principles and practices that influence how people feel, think, and behave from the top to the bottom all across the globe. And there are benefits in the company, in the marketplace, and in society for doing this, in addition to avoiding the terrible risks that come when there's an integrity or performance or risk miss. As Lou Gerstner, who was no teddy bear, said, he was the former CEO of IBM, culture isn't just one aspect of the game, it is the game. And the reality is that although we get dewy-eyed about capitalism, and as Winston Churchill said about democracy, that it's the least worst form of government, well, capitalism is the least worst form of economic organization, but it's got plenty of issues. And one of them is the pressure towards corruption, both internally to make the numbers and so on and so forth, and the culture in acquired companies, and also externally, all the corruption, weak rule of law, conflict of interest, et cetera, in emerging markets. And I'm not going to go through this, but there are a bunch of case studies which are very well known, especially to people in the business school and the law school, that cut across industries, whether it's automotive, energy, heavy industrial, retail, financial services, communications, where the culture failed and therefore the institution failed. So how do we create the culture? The leaders have to basically do what I said, no cutting of corners, and make that real. They have to discipline people and there's no balancing test. If you violate a first order principle, you're fired, or you're retired, or you're rusticated, or you're separated, but you're gone, whatever the word may be. You have to basically have compensation systems that reward integrity, and basically, increasingly, there are these policies called compensation recovery policies, which basically hold back or claw back compensation as penalties inside the company for misdeeds by senior people as well as middle people. So it has to be the generals and the lieutenant generals, not just the troops. There has to be talent and resources in operationalizing all this. There has to be tremendous education and training, which is extremely difficult in emerging markets or in places like Eastern Europe, where we had to overcome the history of the Gestapo and the Stasi to have good education and training. And there has to be employee voice. All scandals, all problems of integrity are caused by the culture of silence, which exists in every company of all shapes and sizes, whatever the industry, and you have to overcome that with a great ombuds system or hotline system where people feel free to come forward and their concerns are followed fairly and honestly. Okay, let me just talk very briefly about a couple of other issues and then defer to my good friend from the business school. Obviously, a critical part of all this is compliance and dealing with legal hazard. Basically, what you're trying to do is to prevent, detect, and respond. But if you think about it for a second, if you're operating in 140 countries around the world, or 100 countries, or 80 countries, figuring out what the law is and what it is that you're going to comply with is tremendously difficult because of the breadth, complexity, variation, uncertainty, and flux of the law. So this is, and it's especially difficult in emerging markets where there may not be real rule of law, where the law, like in China, may not be published consistently, where every local judge is bribed, many local judges, I should say, are bribed, extremely difficult. So this is an absolutely core task, figuring out what is the law that should be followed, and then you have to do all these systems of prevention, detection, and response. It's just critically important. And again, we could spend all night talking about this. It's a tremendously important subject. But I believe it's fine, we should talk about ethics, but I think we have to talk first about adherence to the law. And as I've said, given the complexity of the international setting, compliance with law is an enormously difficult task, which requires both leadership and also management from the CEO and from the top people in the company. There's then the question, of course, of ethics, and the difference between law and ethics, or the mandatory rules are mandated, as I said before, from the outside. Ethical decisions are made from the inside. Companies voluntarily decide to commit themselves to certain standards which then bind the employees as if they were law. And so the first issue is identifying sort of a range of issues, of ethical issues that you can decide whether or not you want to adopt them. The second question is how do you set them on this question of what is right? And sort of there are two dimensions of that in my humble judgment. One is what I would call prudential, which is basically the self-interest of the company. What is the right thing to do from the company's self-interested point of view? But there's also a moral dimension. How do we honor the duties and rights of third parties? And clearly there's not a clear line between prudential and moral, and it's an extremely complicated situation that also depends almost completely on context and multi-factors. It's not, there's no cookie cutter, there's no system of philosophy that dictates what you do. What you do about child labor in China may be different than what you do about discrimination against women in an Arab Islamic country. It's different than what you do about whether or not you build plants to world standards or local standards around the world. So these are extremely difficult and challenging issues. And let me just give you an example of, for example, when do you decide that you're going to follow your global standards as opposed to local law, the law of China? If you're Google, and do you accept the censorship, or do you basically go and when you are censored and you're hacked and your technology is stolen, do you then leave? So there are lots of problems that arise. This is an increasing problem where companies have global standards around the world, but they run into problems of national law, which in theory companies need to follow. So they have the choice of either leaving the country or trying to change the law, or obeying the law even though it might be antithetical to their ethical standards. Extremely difficult problem. There's the problem of exiting rogue states. Do we do business in Iran 10 years ago when Iran was basically threatening to create the bomb and was basically supporting insurgents against American troops? Very difficult problem. On the other hand, as a global company, you can't make geopolitical judgments on every country around the world. So this is a great issue. So this is ethics. Then we have risk and crisis management, which raises all sorts of ethical questions as well. And there's risk and crisis management beyond sort of the legal and ethical issues. There's economic and non-economic, and there's a wide variety of issues here as well. And you have to basically have a sound risk organization. You have to have framework questions like identifying the issues and then determining their importance. And then it's a special case of what do you do about catastrophic problems like Bhopal, like BP, like Fukushima. Again, I don't have time today, but Fukushima, you could argue, was really the fault of TEPCO, Tokyo Electric Power Company. Even though it was an earthquake and a tsunami, it was to some extent foreseeable. And had they, in fact, had the generators above ground, above the sea level in a higher place, the nuclear plants would not have lost electricity and would not have melted down. So this in my judgment, the risk issues have an enormous integrity dimension to them and are critically important. And lastly, there is citizenship, which encompasses compliance, ethics, risk, and so forth, but it basically involves other issues as well. It involves philanthropy, it involves collective action, where you, not for public policy, but trying to put together groups of companies to do the right thing. In 10 seconds when I joined GE, there's something called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which prevents bribery of foreign officials. General counsels from other companies came to me and said, let's gut the FCPA. It's stopping us from getting orders because other countries can bribe, whether you're in Germany, or companies from other companies, whether you're based in Germany or England or France or whatever the case may be. And so we decided instead to level up rather than level down, to try to create an international convention that prohibited bribery in the industrialized countries. So that's just an example of collective action. We also were deeply involved in trying to write a climate change bill involving not just the manufacturers of power generation equipment, but the utilities, the autos, the NGOs in the area. So this is a tremendously important set of activities before you get to public policy, and then public policy itself is critically important. I write a lot about how business is way too self-interested and short-term, and that sort of sound public policy is one of the most important things that we do, trying to create the social goods upon which societies are really built. And so there are many issues there as well, including sort of having good process, where you basically don't corrupt with money, you are fair in facts, you have balanced proposals, you're nonpartisan, and you try to build coalitions outside of the business. So I've talked about a lot of issues, and as I said at the outset, what I was trying to do is just give you an overview of the complexity of the different dimensions of doing business with integrity. I appreciate that you fastened your seatbelts and gone at Mach 2, and I'm now happy to turn it over to my colleagues. So thank you very much for listening.
Ben raised a lot of issues about what companies should be doing to promote ethical leadership and why ethical leadership is important. I want to start with a discussion of a couple of global companies that ran into some big troubles because they didn't have these systems in place. And even when the problems initially arose, they failed to take the proper steps to remedy the situation. And then we'll move into a little bit about what drives a major survey that was done of corporate executives across most of the United States and Canada, but also Europe and Asia, to see the perspective of how they think these things should and can be avoided today and 10 years in the future. So we start with Siemens. And I don't want to cold call or Socratic method anybody, but students, anybody studied what happened with the Siemens scandals about maybe 10, 12 years ago? Nobody wants to volunteer? Nobody knows? How many of you have heard of the Siemens bribery scandals? All right, okay. So I am going to cold call. Oh, come on. Yeah, I want to make this interactive in all of my 12 and a half minutes. What's your name?
Lena.
Lena. So what do you know? Doesn't matter. However little you know is good.
Yeah, I know it was an FCPA Act investigation. They were.
Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, for those of you that...
I think they ended up paying like $400 million or something like that.
That was in Europe. They paid $1.3 billion here. Yeah. So you're right. And do you know what the basic problem, what were they doing?
So, I mean, they had to be bribing officials, and I guess as it was in...
They were bribing officials all over the world. That's why Siemens was so successful. They were bribing the hell out of everybody all over the world. Is that a problem? No, not a problem at all. In fact, up until 1999, the German tax code had a specific deduction for foreign bribes if it was necessary to attract business. So it was embodied in the German legal system, if you can imagine that. But little problem. The OECD started implementing standards around 2000, suggested to countries that they needed to have something akin to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act to prevent widespread bribery of foreign officials by companies around the world. And eventually Germany, the EU, and then when Siemens listed in the United States, of course, they became subject to US law as well, and the law changed in all of the countries that had jurisdiction over Siemens. So what did Siemens do and what did their leadership do? Did they fix the problem? No. Fine, if we can't pay foreign bribes anymore, we will hire consultants, and the consultants will pay the foreign bribes. So, and ultimately that caught up with them when they started seeing, when banks started reporting them for seeing money laundering, when these consultants started calling the auditors saying, hey, where's our money? We're owed $150 million. And when they asked why, well, it came to light that basically they had just shifted the problems to consultants. So what are the effects of these things in the corporate leadership? People lose their jobs. And both the CEO, Kleinfeld, of the company, and the chairman of the board both had to resign or were terminated. And what this led to was the first non-German CEO in the history of Siemens. So, we can see the effects of these things. And then ultimately, what did this mean to Siemens? If we start at the bottom with the red square, they ended up probably spending somewhere around $2 billion between the fines they had to pay. I think they had to pay $400 million to the EU and another $1.3 billion to the SEC. And then they spent about $300 million in defending and having audits and all that to deal with the problem. And eventually, this was eliminated. However, they dropped from being the #1 most respected company in Germany to the #10 most respected company in Germany. Now, some cynics might say the year they paid $2 billion, their revenues were $89 billion. So is this just a cost of doing business? Something to think about. And we have some questions for you later that might engender some discussion. And just to go to the other side of the globe, does anybody know about Citic Pacific? Where's Citic from? What country? China. All right. Run by the Yun family, one of the wealthiest families in all of China. And they got involved in some major problems because they had some mining operations in Australia, and some not so smart finance people in the company decided to embed in the contracts some hedging on foreign currency, and their hedging strategy collapsed. And so they lost $800 million, I believe it was in 2007. The problem was that when they reported an update to their 2007 financial statements after these losses became known, they failed to disclose it and said no material changes had occurred. Months later, they finally disclosed it, and of course, it became a big scandal and led to action by the SEC equivalent of the Hong Kong regulatory authorities. And so, and believe it or not, that lawsuit is actually still going on, even though it was from 2007. They had a trial in November of 2015, and the trial's been extended to the end of this year. And so we'll expect, so again, and what was the issue here? Well, the CEO and the top execs of the company, in essence, hid from their investors and the public this huge loss that was occasioned by some very poor management. Ben talked about performance, and there was a failure of performance coupled with a cover-up, or at least a failure to disclose. The CEO, Larry Yun, was fired, one of the wealthiest men in China. And obviously this is still going on with a significant exposure for more than $1 billion in fines that the Hong Kong authority is seeking from Citic. So lessons of what happens when companies don't incorporate good governance, good management, and ethics. And it's not just about regulatory compliance, as Ben said, it's more than that, and CEOs need to lead by example, and these are examples of a failure of that from happening. We've seen other global scandals, most recently Petrobras in Brazil, that eventually led to the downfall of the president of Brazil, Mossack and Fonseca in Panama with the Panama Papers. You've all heard of that, and obviously we don't have time because of our limited time here to talk about those. But clearly there's a need for ethics in global business. And it's more than just complying with regulation, but also adopting best practices. And that happens when the top emphasizes good corporate governance, as Ben has indicated. However, there is a challenge. These are global companies, and these global companies have to deal with business operations around the world where rules may be different, but more importantly, perceptions of what is ethical or why we should be ethical might be different. And I'll talk a little bit in just a minute or so about studies that have been done on that issue, because you need to understand cultural differences in trying to adopt a global cultural norms for a particular company. Just some interesting tidbits of information. The American Management Association did a 10-year study on issues related to ethics in global leadership, global ethics in leadership. And they asked 1,100 executives some basic questions. The first was, what are the top 5 reasons that you should run your business in an ethical manner? So this was interesting to see what the executives were telling us. And the first was protecting the company brand and reputation. The second one, it's nice, the right thing to do. It's nice that at least it made number 2. And then you can see the others, customer trust and loyalty, what the investors are told. That's hugely important, as it was in the Citic case. And of course, public acceptance and recognition. You know, when you hit ethical issues, I always believe in the front page test. If this came out in the front page, what you just did or what your company is doing, how would that look to the world? How would that look to the investors, to the customers, to the employees? So then they asked these folks, what are the top reasons that lead to companies developing cultural norms? You know, in cultural code of ethics, if you will. And then they asked them, could you tell us what you think that is today and what you think it'll be 10 years from now? So the number one reason today, and this was 2015, is that corporate scandals. So companies see corporate scandals and what it does to companies, like what happened with these 2 companies I mentioned, and it scares them into action. And you know, so I always think of, like, you know, whenever you see a product that has a warning on it, rest assured that somebody sued that company over that warning, you know, so it kind of reminds me of that. And then marketplace competition, because, you know, if we're getting a bad reputation compared to our competitors, that can affect the bottom line. Answering to the investors and demand by the investors, pressure from customers, and globalization. But notice what they said they believed it would be in 10 years. And at that time they said number 1 would be globalization. So that global business would impact this more than anything, in the opinion of these executives. So anyways, just some interesting perspectives about what the executives are telling us is driving the need for this. And specifically, here, and this really goes line in line with what Ben said, so I'll just make it short so I can get to that final study. What are the factors most important for ensuring an ethical culture? And again, this was the question they asked these leaders, the executives of these companies. And it goes a lot with the things that Ben brought up, that it comes from the top, that leaders need to model and establish ethical behavior. And then they need to communicate that so everybody in the company is clear of what the company culture is in that regard, that it be integrated into goals of the company, that it be part of the performance management system, as Ben also mentioned, and that it be part of the recruitment process. So in other words, it needs to be ingrained throughout the company at multiple levels, but it has to start at the top in terms of being role models and come from the top in terms of laying out what those will be. And then finally, to take into account this business of globalization and how it affects ethics, one of my colleagues here at Anderson did a study a while back where they asked a series of executives why they acted ethically, or why they thought it was important to act ethically. And the study demonstrated that it was statistically significant differences between the executives from Western Europe, from Japan, and from the United States. So for the Europeans, it was all about personal standards. Europeans said, the reason I act ethically is because it's important for me to be an ethical person in terms of who I am. For the Japanese, it was about me and the people around me. I'm part of a team, and it's important for me to be ethical so that the team doesn't think poorly of me and so that I don't let the team down. And then, of course, for the U.S. executives, it was about the company. that if you act unethically, that affects the company, the shareholders, the organization, and that was the most important reason to be ethical. So it's just interesting, as you go out in the world and do business in many regions of the world, developing an ethical code or ethical standards for your company needs to incorporate the different parts of the world where you're doing business and the culture and what the motivators for culture, of those cultures to be ethical. So that was it. I will turn it back over to Professor Kim. I stayed within my allotted time, Lucy, and thank you very much.
So thank you very much. These were wonderful presentations. Now it's time for the Q&A. So before I take questions from the audience, I just wanted to pose a question that I just thought up just from listening to Professor Frasius. And it's a question for either or both of you. And it's about, and I try, hopefully I won't make it too academic or too philosophical, but it's about the language of ethics. So you mentioned the Siemens bribery fine. The fine that they had to pay was, a large fine, but it was still, you could argue, the cost of doing business. And the way business people are trained, at least in the US, is, consequentialist thinking, cost-benefit analysis. But it seems to me that cost-benefit analysis is inherently risky. I mean, if you look at the Ford Pinto case, right, they put they assigned a dollar value to human life, and that just took them on the path to unethicality and ended up with this huge scandal where they basically approved a really horrible design for a car. So I guess my question is, when you're talking to your business leaders, you're inside the company and you aspire to be an ethical leader of sorts, how do you approach ethical concerns? Do you try to incorporate the language that they already know? Do you talk about cost-benefit analysis? Or do you speak about first-order principles? And this sort of goes with some of the issues you spoke at the very end about the rationalizations, the reasons for ethical conduct. How do you approach that in dialogue with your business colleagues?
I think that we've got to distinguish again between adherence to the law or the financial rules and ethics, because they really are quite different. I mean, the law and the financial rules are mandated, so you are required to follow them. And when you talk, in my judgment, especially as someone who is a lawyer and was general counsel, you don't do cost-benefit analysis. You are obligated to follow the law or to leave the country if you feel that it's too onerous or it's wrong. And you talk about $2 billion, that was the fines. Actually, the forensic costs were $1 billion. They were not $300 million. They were, and everybody got fired. And the time and effort when you have one of these scandals in terms of being investigated, the whole company comes to a halt, everybody is under suspicion. In the case of Siemens, they had 2,000 business consulting agreements, which were basically bribe agreements, 2,000. So whether it was transportation, healthcare, power, the whole company came to a halt for 2 years. So it's not a free pass when you have these
and I talked to the general counsel, and they actually at one point feared the company might go under, that this might actually collapse the company.
I think number one, you don't do a cost-benefit analysis, but two, we should not underestimate that the cost of doing business was far more than the amount of money they paid in fines and forensic costs. That's number one. So that's the law, and in my judgment, you have to be unstinting in your commitment to following the law. Ethics, I think, I'll defer to the professor and he can talk about, so we share the stage here, but I think it's just terribly important that they want to do what is right in the long-term interest of the company. And a lot of that depends on reputation and sort of how you are perceived by all the different stakeholders. And if you lose their trust, as I said before, every institution, whether it's academic institution, NGO, a government institution, a private sector institution, they are at the end of the day built on trust. That's how they sustain themselves. And you lose the trust when you act in an unethical way.
Yeah, the upper management has to basically define what the company's culture is going to be. And part of that is aspirational, part of that is regulatory compliance, and part of that is making clear that this is important for the company and how the company will measure that up and down the company, whether it's hiring people, measuring performance in terms of performance evaluations, and also creating a vehicle where when employees see questionable behavior and they're not sure what to do, they have a method, a process where they can go and complain or seek counsel to try to resolve these issues. And obviously education and training, all of those things. It's just smart business, because ultimately, even if you look at this as cost benefit, it is a cost benefit long term, because it could affect the long term reputation of the company, and that could affect shareholder value. But if it's just good business to preserve the reputation of the company, the brand, and protect the long term investor value.
Okay, wonderful. Now we can take some questions from the audience. Does anyone have a question? Yes, over there.
Okay, I have a question about professional development and how that falls into ethics. So specifically, I think it was Professor Henneman, you mentioned on kind of a separate subject. One, that the roles should be the same for senior leadership as they are for junior leadership, and also that there should be a one-strike rule. So does that apply to junior people? And if so, how do you develop them professionally? Like if they're just eliminated the first time something happens, or is that like a hard line?
Yeah, I think that the one strike and you're out rule applies to first order principles. People, and it also depends a little bit on the degree of culpability, from mistake to negligence to recklessness to intentional acts. But if it's a first order principle, in my judgment, you to keep the integrity culture, you have to be unstinting in what you do. For example, Mark Hurd, who was the CEO of HP, was basically terminated for $20,000 of expense account misstatements, because the financial accuracy is so important to the company. And even though that's the company probably had revenues of $100 billion or $80 billion, I mean, a huge amount. It was fractional. But because it was such an important principle, he was let go. I'll give you an example. I had a fantastic lawyer in Russia, but who basically misstated his expense account because he went to a strip club. Not unheard of, okay? Canned him in 1 second, shot him right between the eyes. He was the lawyer. He basically had to be the highest integrity. And even though he was a star and very young and had a promising career, I thought that the signal that I had to send the organization was so important that he had to go. So here you have Mark Hurd and you have a young lawyer. The amounts were trivial, but the principle was first order. So I think that is really the critical issue. I would hope that both in business school and law schools, we pay more attention not just to our own personal ethics, and these were personal ethics cases, but also to the ethics of the organization. What is important for the organization to do, and you're part of that. So I'm afraid I'm sort of a little bit of a hard ass on this, but having had to live in this huge organization with 320,000 employees, we had to send clear signals. We had to be very uncompromising when it came to violations of first principles.
A story comes to mind of one of my former executive MBA students was running the division of a major US corporation in China. And he discovered that a couple of his employees in his unit had done something which was borderline unethical as it affected one of their competitors. And so he called in the whole unit and really just kind of talked about, this is not right, and this is not what we do, and this is why. So fortunately, the company had built in a good corporate ethos that had made it down to his level. And he did something rather surprising. He actually called the competitor, disclosed what had occurred, and how they had taken disciplinary action against the individuals involved, and in the interest of full disclosure, which doesn't seem to be a very intuitive thing to do, but it really showed, it demonstrated to this unit that it would be so important that he would go to the great length of disclosing what had taken place to a competitor.
Let me just say one other thing. I think we have an obligation, to your point about professional development. I mean, it's not just the professional schools. Companies have an enormous obligation to train people, especially when they come from different cultures and they may have different views of the rules that you are applying globally. We need a uniform culture. We apply the same rules in Brussels, Beijing, Boston, wherever we are. Sometimes the employees don't understand that. So to your point, in terms of development, we do have an education and training obligation to avoid the situation where they cross the line and have to be let go. So I just want to make that point as well.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, I'm just curious to know, it's like, working for a global company and do business like in, all over the world. And yeah, the company's going to have a policy, regarding this. And being a U.S. company, you're governed by the FCPA. But in some other countries, for example, I'm a lawyer and I practice, in Nigeria. And there are times where certain laws kind of allow you to give gifts to government officials. My question is more how do you balance these little differences in laws depending on where you operate with your company policy and making sure that
Uniform global policy. Anybody who violates it, whether you're in Nigeria, Romania, Russia, Colombia, you're gone. I mean, you cannot waver. And I know this sounds very strange. On gifts and entertainment, we had very strict restrictions on the amount, that you could not give more than basically a token gift. And in societies, perhaps in Nigeria, certainly in China, where it's a gift-giving culture, and they expect, we were often the customer, of course, they expect a gift. We had to say that we had a company policy and that we wouldn't do it. You may have seen, there's this corruption crackdown now in China on luxury goods and for many of the party officials for big-time graft, but also for smaller things like Mont Blanc pens or Rolex watches or things like that. So you have to be extremely careful, and you have to set very clear limits across the globe. And you can lose business. We said no. But let me give you an example. We competed against Siemens. We were not perfect. You can never repeal human nature. There was sin in the city, but we were nothing like Siemens. I think we had a pretty decent culture. We beat them, notwithstanding this bribery, and we competed against them in all these lines of business: transportation, health, power. We had bigger share and bigger margins than they did, and we didn't bribe. You can do it. You can just say no. And many times, if you're in big procurements, for example, some of the civil servants actually, they don't want to get involved in this. They want to do what's right for their country. Some are on the take, some are not. If they're on the take, you say no. And sometimes, surprisingly, they will come back to you. And sometimes they won't even ask if you have a reputation for non-bribery. So I think this is the future of global business. And I think we're here to tell you, the company that I work for competed successfully and beat Siemens in terms of market share and margin.
Yeah, well, go ahead, that's fine, I can.
Oh, sure, thank you. So I have a question within the context of the tension between that which is legal and that which is right. So what is your opinion on the recent press criticism that U.S. tech companies have been facing for their practices exploiting, if you will, the Irish tax laws in doing business in the EU?
I will turn to my colleague I really have a strong view on this, but I will let him, who is a tax expert, speak first.
This is an issue of what they did was not illegal, certainly. Although the European Union now has, in a sense, held otherwise, that has felt that it was to a certain extent violative of their laws and have levied fines, at least against one of those companies. And so this gets to a really tough position that, if you do something legal within the tax code, it's really the code of that. You're following the laws of that country. And in this case, Apple and these major Microsoft and these major companies are doing exactly that. So that's a tough one because, tax is not ethics. It can be, obviously, but it's about compliance. But ultimately, these companies the ethical thought is that they need to think about the long-term consequences of this and how it would be perceived by the public, which could affect their bottom line.
Yeah, let me try a slightly different take on it. My first hire was a tax lawyer who was a great tax lawyer. And I said to him when he came, I said, look, I don't want to hear the words Bermuda or Cayman Islands ever out of your mouth.
How about Ireland?
I want you to be tax efficient, but I want there to be compliance. And I said, I want you to not only cut square corners, but I want you to be well inside the line. So I think when we talk about ethics here and doing right, I don't think any company in the tax area has an obligation to pay more than they owe,
right.
But I think they have an obligation to be smart about not getting too close to the line and basically knowing that the laws are going to change. And if they have practices which, while legal, are questionable, are gamey, that they should basically make a decision that they don't want to have the law come down on them, and they therefore want to be inside the line. We have to make decisions every day in business about gray areas. And you have to make a decision about, are you going to be right up against the black? Are you going to be sort of slightly less gray, or are you going to be, take less risk? That's a very critical part of compliance, actually, is anticipating where the law is going to go, not just what the law is technically at the time. And I view that as sort of legal compliance, not ethics. And so, as I said, we shouldn't pay more than we owe, but we ought to be very mindful of where the law might go and what appears to be wrong, because if it appears to be wrong, there is a chance it will become wrong when the legal authorities start to look at it.
Which is what happened with the
And
EU. So you have to anticipate public policy shifts.
And that is a very, I can't tell you, you can imagine how complicated that is, especially when you're working in multi-jurisdictions and there's no harmonization or convergence of international law. Every jurisdiction is a little bit different.